So if you remember earlier this year, I did a video about a German HIV doctor named Heiko Yesen. According to reporting by BuzzFeed and Vice, this doctor has had dozens of sexual abuse allegations swirling around him for the better part of 2 decades, in what was actually the biggest Me Too scandal Germany's queer community had ever experienced. Even after indicting Yesen in 2016, it took 5 years for the prosecuting attorney's office in Berlin to actually bring the case to court. This is a doctor who successfully sued to have the reports about his misconduct taken offline because, get this, they included too much evidence of guilt. That ruling was only overturned earlier this year, but to this date, the only publication that's mentioned Heiko Yesen's full name in relation to the ongoing trial and charges against him was the Columbia Journalism Review, which of course is American, not German. That's because Yesen had successfully intimidated German publications from listing so much as his first name and last initial. Well, at the beginning of this November, that 2016 indictment finally came to a partial close when he was found guilty of 1 of 5 charges for using his position as a doctor to sexually abuse patients. No jail time, but he was fined 45,000 euros, which was reduced by 9,000 euros due to the psychological burden Yesen endured due to the long length of the trial. Poor him. Unfortunately, the other 4 victims' cases were delayed or dropped. One victim's account was discredited because he was considered too eager to stick the defendant with some kind of charge because he'd put out an ad to find other victims and written down a log of what happened to him at the doctor's office. Since the observations in his log also included reflections on the power imbalance between doctors and patients, the court couldn't rule out that he visited the doctor with the express purpose of disrupting that dynamic. Some of the rationales read like a bizarre form of victim blaming in legalese, but at least the one ruling is better than nothing, right? And obviously he's appealing that ruling. The entire fiasco will now be repeated in front of a higher court. Now, since the conviction, numerous media outlets have finally printed Heiko J. Now, I get the presumption of innocence, but what about protecting the public from prolific sexual abusers? What's interesting about the entire Yesen saga is that it's very much tied up in the German concept of privacy, which in some ways is fundamentally at odds with the notion of adversarial journalism. Not stigmatizing people who haven't been convicted is one of the pillars of reporting in a country where private individuals, especially Jewish people, were once actively demonized by propaganda newspapers like Der Stürmer, whose propaganda played a role in inciting and justifying the Holocaust. The problem is that private individuals sometimes manage to amass incredible amounts of wealth and power. What happens when they abuse that power, only to then cry foul when they get called out for those abuses? Now, this is a major problem in German journalism, and one that's playing out in another controversial case that even has some of the same players. Julian Reichelt, a journalist for BuzzFeed's Ippen, helped make the accusations against Yesen public. Reichelt has since garnered a reputation as one of the few mainstream reporters who strives to hold powerful men accountable for sexual misconduct allegations. She set out to write an exposé about sexual misconduct allegations against Julian Reichelt, former editor-in-chief of the right-wing Bild tabloid. The story was killed by the main investor in Ippen, who happens to be Dirk Ippen. Reichelt and the other journalists were never given any journalistic or legal justification for the decision, as if there really was one. Later, a spokesman argued that it wasn't in their interests to write about another publisher with whom they compete. Maybe, but it also kind of sounds like one powerful media figure not wanting to set a precedent of publishing takedown exposés of other powerful media figures. The first waft the public got of the scandal was in March of 2021, when an article was published in the magazine Der Spiegel with a title that translates as "Screw, Promote, Fire." The article reported on Reichelt's behavior toward women and alluded to abuses of power. After the publication of the article, Reichelt took legal action because he apparently wasn't able to tell his side of the story. As it turns out, the questions Spiegel had sent him for comment went to his parent company, Axel Springer, not to his company, Bild. Reichelt submitted a sworn affidavit claiming he had never received their questions. The court determined that this omission violated the journalistic codex on reporting of people accused of wrongdoing and criminal behavior. So after the court ruled against them, Spiegel edited the online article and the article was removed from further print editions. The court order even went so far as to prohibit Spiegel from reporting on his misconduct with other women or other abuses of power. Even though the article was removed from further prints of the magazine, it was still available online, until just recently. This November, a court ordered the magazine even take the article offline after Reichelt filed a legal complaint. But what's especially weird about it is that Reichelt was already fired by that point. But not because of the now suppressed German press coverage, because of American press coverage, once again. He was fired after Ben Smith wrote an extensive article about it in the New York Times. And for this, I'm gonna have to take a second to talk about Bildt's parent company, Axel Springer. In the Times article, Smith detailed the rise of Axel Springer, both the man and the company. Springer the man was a notorious right-wing propagandist. His tabloid newspaper's incendiary reporting on student protests against a visit from the Shah of Iran in 1967 is largely blamed for creating the violent atmosphere that led to the deadly shooting of Benno Ohnesorg by a West German police officer and Stasi collaborator. Ohnesorg's death set off riots and ignited Germany's student left movement in the late 60s. After a failed attempt to assassinate Rudi Dutschke, another student leftist who had called on Axel Springer to be expropriated by the German government, one of the biggest waves of uprisings and unrest in Germany's post-war history were ignited. There was an attempt to block the distribution of Springer's newspapers nationwide, which led to massive street battles with the police, and so some claimed that Bildt, Axel Springer's tabloid, had blood on its hands. It's also one of the reasons Axel Springer's Hamburg office was bombed in 1972 by the militant leftist group, the Red Army faction. So saying that Axel Springer and its subsidiaries have a history of controversy would be a bit of an understatement. After Springer's death, Game of Thrones-style legal infighting went on to determine who would take over his media empire, and in the end, the winner turned out to be Springer's fifth wife, who had been the family nanny. She's now on the company's supervisory board, but the de facto head of Axel Springer is a man, Mathias Döpfner, whom she graciously handed the keys to the kingdom in 2002, naming him the company's chief executive. Last year, she gave him more than $1 billion in Axel Springer stock, making him a very powerful international media figure. Why is this important? Because it turns out Döpfner personally protected Reichelt during an extensive investigation into his misconduct. According to the Times article, Döpfner said in an exchange with a friend that it was good that there were people around willing to stand up to what he described as reminiscent of East Germany's dictatorship. Indeed, the fearless editor of a right-wing tabloid that has literally incited deadly uprisings is the one being persecuted. Now, Döpfner has spent much of the past few years buying up organizations like Politico as if they could get any worse, and he's been trying to get his hands on Axios as well as if they could get any worse. And so here's a really wacky part coming up. The Times article also references an internal investigation into Reichelt's behavior, in which a young woman told about her relationship with Reichelt, as well as the professional quid pro quo that went hand in hand with their dalliance. After the article in Der Spiegel from March of this year, the one that has since been taken down, Reichelt was put on leave for 2 weeks before getting his position back, gave a few carefully worded pseudo-apologies in the media, and was then ordered to share his position with a female editor. Imagine if every powerful man who's ever been Me Too'd, all they had to do was apologize and then just share whatever their job was with a female counterpart. But that all changed when the Times article came out on October 17. He was let go within a day of its publication, and Axel Springer claimed they learned of new allegations from the article. Isn't it interesting that Axel Springer claimed they had no idea when the accusations they're referring to came primarily from their own internal investigation? It's also very interesting how much of an impact critical media coverage can have on the powerful. Why was it necessary for a US newspaper to publish an article about a German editor? Well, for all its flaws, and there are way too many to list here, the US's free speech laws, at least when it comes to journalists who report on public figures accused of misconduct, are generally better. The story by Julian Reichelt and her colleagues that was blocked by Dirk Ippen was ultimately printed in Der Spiegel, and it was documented, surprise, surprise, inappropriate correspondence between Reichelt and female employees who worked under him, as well as his inability to separate the private from the professional. Would he have been fired if it weren't for that Times story? I don't know, because Germany seems to have major freedom of press issues. Why is it that some of the most impactful reporting on these Me Too scandals came from non-German press? What does that say about the state of journalism in Germany? Nothing good if you ask me.